You ever laughed at the idea that someone emotionally distant is easy to win? That belief sounds powerful at first, almost like control. But pause for a moment, because what if the truth is not that they are easy, but that you are misunderstanding distance as opportunity? And in that misunderstanding, many lose themselves trying to turn silence into love and absence into affection. There is a deeper law in emotional life that most people ignore. You cannot conquer what is not offering itself to be held. An avoidant heart is not a puzzle to solve, nor a prize to unlock. It is often a system built around protection, not invitation. And when you approach it with the mindset of easy, you are not seeing a person. You are seeing a challenge to your ego. But divine wisdom does not operate through conquest. It operates through alignment. What is meant for you will not require you to shrink, overextend, or emotionally beg for consistency. Real love does not force itself into closed doors. It stands with dignity outside until the door is willingly opened. And here is the turning point most people miss. The more you chase emotional distance, the more you teach it to run. Not because you are unworthy, but because pressure is not safety. And without safety, there is no surrender, only retreat. So when you say they are too easy, life quietly asks you back, easy for what? Easy to lose yourself in? Easy to confuse confusion with chemistry? Easy to abandon your own peace just to feel chosen in fragments? There is a higher way. A way where you no longer negotiate your self-respect for intermittent attention, where your nervous system is no longer trained to celebrate inconsistency, where love is no longer a battlefield, but a place of mutual presence. And in that shift, something powerful happens. You stop trying to win people who are not available, and you start becoming someone who only aligns with what is emotionally honest. Because true love is not proven by pursuit. It is revealed in reciprocity. And the moment you stop treating emotional distance as a challenge to fix, you finally begin to experience love as it was meant to be, steady, conscious, and whole. Avoidant attachment is often misunderstood as indifference, confidence, or emotional simplicity. But beneath that surface lies a far more complex inner architecture, shaped by protection rather than preference. When someone appears easy to detach from, to read, or to move around emotionally, it can create the illusion that they are straightforward, low maintenance, or even predictable in their distance. Yet what is actually being observed is not ease, it is defense, a carefully constructed emotional system designed over time to reduce exposure to vulnerability, disappointment, or emotional overwhelm. At its core, avoidance is not the absence of feeling. It is the management of feeling. It is the mind and nervous system learning, often through experience, that closeness can come with cost. So instead of leaning in fully, the avoidant structure learns to regulate intimacy by stepping back when emotional intensity rises. This stepping back is not always conscious rejection. It is often automatic self-preservation. What looks like calmness is frequently containment. What looks like independence may be emotional self-containment taken to an extreme. And what looks like ease is often a highly refined skill of not needing too much from anyone, because needing has once felt unsafe. This is why labeling such individuals as easy becomes misleading. Ease implies availability without resistance. But avoidance is not absence of resistance. It is resistance already integrated into behavior. The distance is not accidental. It is functional. It serves a purpose in their internal world. It creates space where emotional activation is regulated, where dependency is minimized, and where control over emotional exposure is maintained. In this way, avoidance becomes less about the other person and more about maintaining internal equilibrium. Many people misinterpret this dynamic because they engage with the surface rather than the pain system beneath it. When someone does not chase, does not react intensely, or does not display overt emotional need, it can be mistaken for emotional simplicity. But in reality, the emotional world of an avoidant individual can be deeply active internally while appearing quiet externally. Thoughts are processed privately. Feelings are compartmentalized. Needs are delayed, diluted, or redirected inward. This creates the illusion that there is less emotional complexity when, in fact, there is often a high degree of internal regulation happening constantly. The protective nature of avoidance is often born from repeated emotional experiences where closeness became overwhelming, inconsistent, or even unsafe. Over time, the nervous system adapts. It learns that distance equals control, and control equals safety. So the person becomes skilled at maintaining just enough connection to avoid loneliness, while keeping enough distance to avoid vulnerability. This balance is delicate and often unconscious, yet it defines their relational rhythm. When someone approaches this system thinking it is easy, they unknowingly collide with a structure that is not designed to be pursued in a traditional emotional sense. Effort, in the conventional sense, does not always translate into closeness here. In fact, increased emotional pressure can activate deeper withdrawal, not because of lack of interest, but because the system interprets intensity as risk. The more emotionally charged the environment becomes, the more the protective response activates. Understanding this shifts perception entirely. What seemed like simplicity is revealed as strategy. What seemed like emotional lightness is revealed as emotional regulation. And what seemed easy begins to show itself as carefully maintained distance shaped by experience, habit, and internal protection. When emotional distance is met with pursuit, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Beneath the surface of the relationship dynamic, it is not simply two people reacting to each other, it becomes a feedback loop between pressure and withdrawal, intensity and retreat. The more one person tries to close the gap, the more the other feels the need to widen it, not out of cruelty or lack of care, but as an automatic attempt to restore internal balance. What begins as a desire for connection can slowly transform into a cycle where both people feel misunderstood, yet neither recognizes how their own responses are shaping the outcome. Chasing emotional distance often comes from a place of heightened awareness of inconsistency. When someone feels that warmth is intermittent, attention is unpredictable, or emotional presence is not stable, the nervous system seeks resolution. It tries to solve the uncertainty by increasing effort, attention, or emotional expression. The unconscious belief is simple. If I do more, they will finally stay closer. But this belief, while deeply human, often collides with a different internal system in the bull, an avoidant partner, one that interprets increased emotional demand not as reassurance, but as pressure. Pressure is not always loud. It does not need arguments or confrontation to exist. It can live in repeated checking, over-explaining feelings, seeking constant validation, or trying to create emotional closeness through intensity. From the outside, these actions can look like love or commitment. From the inside of an avoidant system, however, they may register as loss of space. And space, for someone who regulates safety through distance, is essential. When that space feels threatened, the instinct is not to lean in. It is to step back. This is where the paradox forms. The more one person tries to secure closeness, the more the other experiences a need to protect autonomy. And the more autonomy they protect, the more insecure the first person becomes, leading to even greater pursuit. It is not that either person is wrong. It is that both are responding to internal signals that are not being translated into shared understanding. Over time, this dynamic can subtly shift the emotional tone of the connection. The pursuing partner may begin to feel like they are always reaching, always initiating, always explaining. Their emotional world becomes oriented around proximity management. How close is close? Enough. How distant is too distant? What response means reassurance? What silence means withdrawal? This creates emotional hyper-awareness, where peace becomes conditional on the other person's responsiveness. Meanwhile, the avoidant partner may begin to feel increasingly encroached upon, not necessarily because the other is doing something objectively wrong, but because their internal threshold for emotional intensity is being exceeded. In response, they may reduce communication, delay replies, or emotionally simplify interactions, not as punishment but as regulation. The intention is often not to disconnect, but to reduce internal pressure. Yet neither side sees the full picture in the moment. One experiences urgency, the other experiences pressure. One interprets distance as risk of loss. The other interprets closeness as risk of overwhelm. Without awareness, each action taken to restore comfort for one person increases discomfort for the other. What makes this pattern particularly difficult is that effort is not the issue. Misalignment is. Effort without emotional attunement becomes noise. It loses its ability to create connection, and instead becomes part of the cycle that sustains separation. The more energy is invested in closing the gap without understanding the nervous system dynamics at play, the more entrenched the pattern becomes. And so the relationship begins to revolve not around mutual presence, but around reaction management. One person tries to get closer, the other tries to stabilize distance, and both slowly drift into roles rather than connection. Real connection does not begin with intensity, it begins with safety. Not the kind of safety that is declared in words, but the kind that is felt in the nervous system, when presence does not feel like pressure and closeness does not feel like threat. Many people misunderstand connection as something that is created through effort, persuasion, emotional expression, or urgency. But real connection is not manufactured through force. It is revealed through consistency that does not overwhelm, and presence that does not demand immediate emotional surrender. When safety is missing, even genuine affection can feel like intrusion. The nervous system does not interpret intention alone. It interprets impact. So someone can care deeply and still be experienced as overwhelming if their way of expressing that care disrupts another person's internal regulation. This is where patience becomes more than a virtue. It becomes a form of emotional intelligence. Patience is not passive waiting. It is the disciplined ability to remain present without escalating pressure when the other person is not yet fully open. Consistency plays a similar role. In emotionally uncertain dynamics, inconsistency creates vigilance. The mind begins tracking patterns, searching for meaning in fluctuations, trying to predict emotional availability. But consistency slowly dissolves this hypervigilance. When someone shows up in a steady way, not overwhelming, not withdrawing unpredictably, but simply present in a grounded rhythm, the nervous system begins to recalibrate. It learns that connection does not require urgency. It learns that closeness does not always precede loss. And this learning is not intellectual, it is biological. Inviting connection, rather than forcing it, is a completely different relational posture. Forcing connection often comes from fear. Fear of losing someone, fear of being replaced, and fear of not being enough. Invitation, on the other hand, comes from groundedness. It communicates, I am here, I am open, but I am not chasing you out of your own emotional boundaries. This creates space for the other person to move toward connection without feeling cornered by it. In avoidant dynamics specifically, this distinction becomes even more important. A person who is protective of their emotional autonomy does not respond well to emotional compression. When they feel that their space to process, withdraw, or regulate is being respected, something counterintuitive often happens. They begin to approach on their own terms, not because they were persuaded, but because the environment no longer feels threatening. Safety does not force closeness. It removes the internal alarm that blocks it. This is why patience is often misunderstood. People confuse patience with inaction or emotional neglect, but in reality, it is active restraint guided by awareness. It is the ability to feel intensity without converting it into pressure. It is choosing not to escalate when anxiety demands reassurance. It is the decision to remain emotionally steady even when uncertainty tempts reaction. This steadiness communicates something far more powerful than repeated attempts to prove value. It communicates emotional stability. Over time, consistency and patience create a relational environment where defensiveness can soften. Not instantly and not always predictably, but gradually. The nervous system begins to recognize patterns that do not require withdrawal. Moments of closeness no longer feel like traps. Moments of space no longer feel like abandonment. The extremes begin to settle. But this only happens when connection is not treated as a conquest. When someone is not seen as a puzzle to solve or a distance to overcome, but as a human being with internal rhythms that cannot be rushed. Real connection respects timing. It does not interpret delay as rejection or space as loss. Instead, it allows emotional unfolding to happen without force. In such an environment, trust is not demanded. It is earned through repeated experiences of emotional safety. And once trust begins to form in this way, connection becomes less about pursuit and more about mutual orientation. Two people start to find rhythm not through pressure, but through presence that does not overwhelm the system designed to protect them. Self-worth is not something that should fluctuate based on someone else's availability, attention, or emotional consistency. Yet in many relational dynamics, especially where emotional uncertainty is present, people begin to unconsciously trade their inner stability for moments of external validation. A reply becomes reassurance. Silence becomes doubt. A small gesture becomes a lifeline. Over time, the internal reference point shifts from, "How do I feel about myself?" to, "How is this person responding to me?" And in that shift, self-worth stops being self-generated and starts becoming externally regulated. This is where negotiation begins quietly, not in obvious decisions, but in subtle emotional compromises. Someone may start accepting less communication than they actually need, convincing themselves that it is patience. They may accept inconsistency, convincing themselves that it is understanding. They may accept emotional ambiguity, convincing themselves that it is depth. But beneath these rationalizations, there is often a deeper process happening, the gradual lowering of emotional standards in order to maintain proximity to someone who is not fully offering presence. Attention crumbs are not always obvious neglect. Sometimes they appear as intermittent warmth, occasional clarity, or brief moments of closeness that interrupt longer periods of distance. These fragments can be powerful because they create contrast. The mind begins to cling not to the overall pattern, but to the peaks. It remembers the moments of connection and uses them as evidence to endure the absence enough between. This creates a psychological loop where inconsistency becomes strangely reinforcing because the relief feels so significant compared to the deprivation. But self-worth becomes compromised when those fragments begin to define the baseline of what is acceptable. A person starts adjusting their emotional expectations downward, not because their needs have disappeared, but because their attachment to potential outweighs their response to reality. They begin to invest in what could be, rather than what consistently is. And in doing so, they slowly detach from their own internal clarity. Divine emotional wisdom does not operate in fragmentation. It does not ask a person to live in cycles of emotional scarcity and temporary relief. It calls for stability, where presence is not sporadic, and care is not conditional on mood or distance. When self-worth is aligned with this principle, it becomes non-negotiable, not in an aggressive or rigid way, but in a quiet internal certainty that does not require external permission to remain intact. The moment someone begins to negotiate their worth for attention, the relationship ceases to be an equal exchange and becomes an emotional economy where access is inconsistent and value is constantly questioned. In such a space, anxiety grows because certainty is removed. And when certainty is removed, the mind begins to work harder to secure it, often by offering more patience, more understanding, more emotional flexibility. But this increased offering rarely resolves the imbalance. It often deepens it. True self-worth does not demand perfect behavior from others, but it does recognize patterns. It does not collapse in response to distance, but it does observe whether distance is accompanied by care or indifference. It does not confuse scarcity with significance. Just because something is rare does not mean it is valuable. Just because attention is intermittent does not mean it is meaningful. Value is measured by consistency, not intensity. When a person is anchored in self-worth, their emotional decisions begin to shift. They stop interpreting inconsistency as something they must adapt to in order to be chosen. They stop over-explaining their needs to people who repeatedly overlook them. They stop translating emotional neglect into personal challenge. Instead, they begin to recognize that their need for stability is not excessive, it is foundational. This internal shift changes the entire relational field, because when self-worth is no longer negotiable, attention crumbs lose their emotional power. They no longer create highs and lows that destabilize the nervous system. They become what they are, insufficient patterns of engagement that do not meet the requirement for emotional security. And from that clarity, a different kind of decision-making emerges, one that is not driven by fear of loss, but by respect for inner equilibrium. Divine love, in its purest understanding, is not defined by emotional chaos, pursuit, or dependency. It is steady in nature, not because it lacks feeling, but because it is anchored in inner alignment rather than external fluctuation. It does not rise and fall based on someone's attention, nor does it collapse when faced with distance. Instead, it maintains an internal equilibrium that allows connection to exist without distortion. This steadiness is often misunderstood in a world that equates intensity with truth, yet true emotional depth is not found in volatility. It is found in grounded presence. When love becomes anxious, it begins to operate from fear rather than faith. Fear of being forgotten, fear of being replaced, fear of not being enough. These fears quietly begin to shape behavior. The heart starts to monitor responses, measure delays, and interpret silence as meaning. Love, in this state, becomes reactive. It tries to secure what it feels slipping away, not realizing that in doing so, it often distorts the very connection it seeks to preserve. Anxiety in love creates urgency, and urgency removes space. Without space, connection becomes pressure, and what was meant to be a bond becomes a burden on both nervous systems involved. Chasing is one of the most visible expressions of anxious love. It is the attempt to close emotional distance through effort, explanation, repetition, or sacrifice. It often comes from genuine care, but care without grounding becomes overextension. The more someone chases, the more they position their emotional stability outside themselves. Their sense of peace becomes tied to response. Their sense of value becomes tied to availability. And their sense of love becomes tied to proximity. In this structure, love is no longer experienced as a state of being. It becomes a state of earning. Begging, whether overt or subtle, is another distortion that arises from anxious attachment to outcome rather than alignment. It is not always literal pleading. Sometimes it appears as over-explaining emotions, repeatedly proving loyalty, or constantly adjusting oneself to avoid abandonment. At its core, begging is the surrender of internal authority. It communicates, consciously or not, that the relationship is more important than self-respect. But divine emotional order does not require self-abandonment to maintain connection. Anything that demands the erosion of self in order to survive is not aligned with wholeness. Collapsing emotionally is perhaps the deepest expression of anxious love. It is the moment where internal regulation is lost and the entire emotional system becomes dependent on external behavior. A message can determine mood. A delay can determine self-worth. A change in tone can determine emotional security. In this state, the individual is no longer anchored in themselves. They are floating in the reactions of another person. This creates instability not only within the relationship, but within the self, because identity becomes fragmented and reactive. Divine love does not function through this fragmentation. It is not detached in the sense of being indifferent, but it is detached from fear. It allows space for uncertainty without immediately converting it into panic. It allows silence without assuming abandonment. It allows distance without interpreting it as rejection. This does not mean it ignores reality. It means it interprets reality through stability rather than anxiety. There is a profound difference between emotional presence and emotional dependency. Presence allows you to feel deeply while remaining rooted. Dependency removes rooting and places emotional grounding in someone else's behavior. Divine love encourages presence. It allows the heart to remain open without becoming unanchored. It says, I can care deeply without losing myself. I can love without shrinking. I can feel without collapsing. This kind of love does not rush to fix uncertainty through emotional overextension. It does not try to force clarity from confusion. Instead, it observes patterns, respects boundaries, and maintains dignity even in emotional vulnerability. It understands that true connection cannot be sustained through fear-based behavior, because fear always distorts perception. When love is steady, it becomes transformative rather than consuming. It does not drain the self in pursuit of validation. It expands the self through alignment. It does not demand constant reassurance to exist. It trusts in consistency over time. And in that trust, emotional maturity begins to form. The heart learns that it does not need to chase to be chosen, beg to be valued, or collapse to be seen. Healing does not begin in the moment someone finally chooses you, returns your message, or starts giving you what you were once chasing. It begins in a quieter and far more difficult moment, the moment you stop reaching for what repeatedly withdraws from you. It begins when your energy is no longer directed toward emotionally unavailable spaces and instead starts returning home to you. This shift is not dramatic on the outside, but internally it is a complete restructuring of how love, value, and attention are understood. When a person repeatedly pursues those who are not emotionally present, their inner world slowly adapts to instability. The mind becomes trained to interpret inconsistency as normal, effort as proof of worth, and emotional distance as something that must be solved. In this state, energy is constantly projected outward. Thoughts revolve around timing, responses, tone changes, and the meaning behind silence. Life becomes reactive rather than rooted, and in that reactivity, the self is slowly forgotten. Healing begins when this outward projection starts to reverse, when attention is no longer invested in decoding unavailable behavior. Something powerful happens. Space is created. At first, this space feels uncomfortable because the nervous system has been conditioned to constant emotional scanning. Silence feels unfamiliar. Stillness feels empty. But this discomfort is not a sign of loss. It is a sign of recalibration. The mind is no longer being fed the cycle of anticipation and disappointment, so it begins to settle into itself again. Stopping the pursuit of unavailable people is not an act of punishment or emotional withdrawal. It is an act of redirection. It is the moment where energy stops being used to bridge gaps that the other person is not attempting to close. And in that redirection, a subtle but profound realization emerges. Effort alone cannot replace mutual willingness. You can extend understanding, patience, and emotional openness, but if it is not met halfway, it becomes depletion rather than connection. As this realization deepens, identity begins to shift. No longer is worth measured by who responds, who stays inconsistent, or who provides intermittent attention. Instead, worth begins to reconnect with internal alignment. The question slowly transforms from, how do I get them to stay, into, why was I willing to shrink for something that did not meet me fully? This question is not asked with judgment, but with clarity. And clarity is one of the most important foundations of healing. Healing also involves a shift in attraction patterns. When someone is deeply conditioned to emotional unavailability, availability can initially feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. Consistency may feel less exciting than unpredictability. Calm may feel less stimulating than emotional highs and lows. But as healing progresses, The nervous system begins to recognize that intensity is not the same as depth, and instability is not the same as love. What once felt like chemistry begins to reveal itself as activation. What once felt like connection begins to reveal itself as emotional pursuit. In this transition, a new internal standard starts to form. Not a rigid list of requirements, but a grounded sense of emotional truth. You begin to recognize relationships not by how strongly they pull your attention, but by how safely they hold your presence. You stop confusing longing with love and start valuing reciprocity over potential. This is where emotional maturity quietly takes root, not in dramatic decisions, but in consistent internal realignment. Becoming someone who aligns with emotional honesty means no longer investing deeply in patterns that repeatedly deny presence. It means noticing when energy is one-sided and choosing not to escalate investment in it. It means allowing distance where distance is chosen, without turning it into a problem to fix or a challenge to overcome. This is not emotional shutdown, it is emotional precision. And in this precision, something unexpected happens. The space that was once occupied by chasing begins to fill with self-awareness. The energy that was once scattered into uncertainty begins to consolidate into clarity. You start to feel your own emotional center again, not as something dependent on response, but as something stable within you. That is where healing quietly becomes irreversible. Not because everything around you changes immediately, but because you stop abandoning yourself in the pursuit of those who never fully arrived. Thank you for being here and sharing this moment. May your path ahead be clear, steady, and grounded in truth. Goodbye, and may you carry peace within you wherever you go.